Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. Um, so again, I just want to say a massive thank you to everyone who has liked, shared, and subscribed so far. Still waiting on some comments to come through, but all good things come to those who wait, as they say. Um, so today's case, I just want to clarify that everything that is going to be discussed, it's only what the police believed happened. Because as of yet, the guy that was convicted for this murder, he still has never admitted his guilt. Even in during the cold case, like he clarified that he was innocent, blah blah blah, and even though the amount of evidence that was against him saying that he wasn't, he still testified that he was innocent. So the police could only go by on what they believed happened. So the case that we're going to discuss today will be that one of Matthew Hardman. Um, Another thing I just want to point out is obviously the name Hardman. So obviously, usually on these sort of channels, we would refer to the perpetrator by their surname. I'm not actually going to do that because the name Hardman, um, it just seems like a juxtaposition. It just seems like the polar opposite of what this man actually is. So I will be referring to him as Matthew. So with that aside, we're gonna go delving into the story of Matthew Hardman and the murder of Mabel Lashon. So, just a little backstory on Matthew. He was born in 1984. His mother, Julie Hardman, she worked as a psychiatric nurse. There are some reports that refer to her as Julia. There are other reports referring to her as Julie. So I'm just going to stick to the name Julie. It's just sort of easier for me to remember because my own mother is called Julie. Um, his father, so his father's never been named, but he passed away in 1998 from an asthma attack. So already, I mean, at that point, Matthew would have been 14 years old, nearly 15. So you can imagine, obviously, at that age, like you losing your father at that age, it can't have been that easy for him. No, I'm not justifying what he goes on to do, but if you're already sort of fragile in that aspect in your mind, so going through grief at that young of an age is not going to be easy for anyone. So Matthew grew up in Anglesey, which is a small island on the coast of northwest Wales. And he grew up in a little village which actually holds a record for the longest place name in Europe. I'm just going to clarify, I'm not actually going to try and pronounce this name. What I am going to do is I'm just going to post a short video here um, of someone actually saying the place name because it is ridiculously long. So yeah, just gonna.
Ever wondered how to pronounce the longest place name in Europe? Let's have a go and repeat after me. Llanfair pwll gwyn gill go ger y chwyrn drobwll Llantysilio go goch.
So with obviously the place having this really long name, it was described as a tourist hotspot. So obviously people would come far and wide to have their photo taken with the sign displaying the name. I think there's a really famous one where it's like above a shop. A lot of places that people do actually shorten this name, but even the shortened versions are still really hard to pronounce. So, Matthew himself, he was described as keeping himself to himself, never to get in any fights. He was extremely caring and he loved everything sci fi. He was also described as odd and bit of a loner. But however, it was soon discovered through the investigation that he actually had a fascination with vampires and the occult. Friends even went on to describe how Matthew had said that he wanted to kill someone to become immortal. So, on the Saturday, the 24th of November 2001, Matthew had broken into the bungalow of 90-year-old Mabel Lechon. Mabel, she was sitting in her chair in front of her telly, and Matthew had snuck up behind her and then went on to stab her 22 times. So we're already talking about complete overkill to start with, because it only takes a few stabs to actually kill someone, depending obviously where you do actually stab them. But I mean, yeah, probably a couple of stabs, maybe a few at a push, to actually end someone's life. To just go on and stab them 22 times, complete overkill, unnecessary, just plain cruel. Right? You just prolong the excitement, really, because you're not really prolonging any suffering, because the person will already be dead at that point. So most of these stab wounds, they actually went through Mabel's shoulder blades. I believe they believed that the first one went through her shoulder blades, but there were some in her neck. They in her chest. So this suggested that Matthew had obviously snuck up behind her. He had obviously stabbed her in the back first, obviously gone for the neck, and then obviously moved around to stab her in the chest. So he, at this point, had then slashed the back of Mabel's legs, and the police believed that this was an attempt to drink her blood. Obviously, as discussed, Matthew was obsessed with vampires. Just want to obviously clarify, as we all know, that he completely, if it was his chance or his belief that he was a vampire in this moment, he completely fucked up, excuse my language, because we all know vampires have to be let in to attack. They don't break into your home. Or that's how the story goes anyway. So obviously, yeah, Matthew had slit the back of her legs to try and drink, in an attempt to try and drink some blood. So obviously, at this point, with Mabel being dead, her heart was no longer pumping blood around her body, so nothing was obviously coming out, and this would have frustrated Matthew. At this point, he then went on to actually remove Mabel's heart from her chest cavity, which, if you know anything about mortuary workers and things like that, it's a notoriously difficult thing to do, to actually remove someone's heart, because you have to go through an incredibly thick bone, and they actually have to use a circular saw to go through this, whereas Matthew was only using a knife at this point. So during this, after he had removed the heart, he had then made an incision at the top, it's believed. He had squeezed the contents of the blood into a pan. He had then drunk the contents, wrapped the heart in some newspaper, placed it in the pan, and put it by the armchair. He then placed a crude assortment of objects around Mabel's body. So they actually found poker sticks in the shape of a cross, so sort of like a crucifix, if you will. And he had even taken her candlesticks and placed them around her body. He then covered her body with a blanket, and he exited out of the property on the way he came in. So, a little backstory on Mabel Lachon. So, as said, she was 90 years old at the time of the murder. So, that would have placed her birth at around 1910, maybe 1911. So, Mabel had lived in Anglesey for her whole life, and she had been in her bungalow for over 50 years. She had lived there with her husband, who had died a little while before this actually happened. So, obviously, I already told you that Mabel was completely on her own. So, she was described as really enjoying her own company and living independently. And she was said to have not had much family. I mean, her and her husband never had children. So she was completely independent living. I believe her only source of company that come round was the Mills and Wills lady, who was the one that ended up finding her body. So on the Sunday, the 25th of November, the Mills and Wills lady did actually come round around midday to drop off Mabel's lunch. Now, obviously, just want to point out as well, so Mabel, she was described as being in really good health for her advanced age, but she had some eyesight problems and she was also hard of hearing. While she was at home, especially during the night, she would turn her hearing aids off, and this was her way of trying to save the battery. So she had like no other issues apart from these couple of little things. So the lady, she was knocking on the door to obviously deliver Mabel's food. For those of you who don't really know what Meals and Wheels is or was, I'm not really sure if they still actually operate to this day, but they would come round to vulnerable residents to deliver hot food. So obviously, even someone in Mabel's case, she might have some form of issue that prevented her from cooking her own meals. So this Meals and Wheels sort of delivery is absolutely ideal for people like her. So the lady went on to say she wasn't worried because she knew that Mabel was hard of hearing. So she actually went back round the back of the property, and round the back of the property, Mabel had a big French window. And this is when the lady noticed that the bottom pane, it was actually smashed. It's believed that Matthew had picked up a piece of slate and thrown it through the window, crawled in. So the lady's let herself into the house, and after a short search, she's come across Mabel's body still in the armchair, covered by the blanket. And obviously, it was with the amount of blood, there would have been the amount of blood evidence. It was obvious Mabel had died at this point in a really brutal way. So the police were swiftly called. They come down and they quickly cornered off the house, and they began their investigations into Mabel's attack. So, doing their investigations, forensics were on the scene and took DNA evidence from the blood splatter, and they even found lip marks around the rim of the saucepan. So all of this blood, it ended up being tested, and it was a positive match for Mabel's. But then on the pane of the window that Matthew had broken into, there was a small blood mark on there, and this was also tested. And obviously the blood was matched to Mabel, but then there was a DNA match in this blood that wasn't Mabel's. So the police had their potential first lead. So the police quickly discovered that this DNA match, it gave an age range of a male that was between the age of 18 to 60. So they then went about of putting out a nationwide search and asked any men in the area that were between these two ages to come forward, be tested, so they could obviously eliminate them from the search. They also found small denim fibres on the walls and soft furnishings. So obviously we all know that, after a certain amount of time, like wear and tear, fibres from your clothing do attach to other bits around your house. And it's why obviously over time your clothes do end up looking a bit frayed. So the police had actually found this small amount of evidence as well, and obviously how many 90-year-olds you actually see walking around in denim. So at first the police, they believed that the blood from Mabel's heart, this had been flushed down the toilet or the sink. So during their investigation they couldn't actually find any evidence of this. And then police and then obviously found the lip mark around the rim of the saucepan. And police had also found trainer prints, and this gave them another potential lead to go on. So they found a trainer print in a pool of blood, or around obviously the initial crime scene, like obviously the living room. So police, they were able to identify from Mabel's wounds what knife it was that was used in the attack. They believed that the knife was around 6 inches long. The knife would have had a single cutting edge. Excuse me. So a 6-inch long knife with a single cutting edge. So around a week after Mabel's murder, the police come across the first person of interest, and just a little claimer, this portion of the story, it does talk about suicide, so it is something that you don't want to listen to. You can skip this part. So the police discovered a 37-year-old man. He had committed suicide by setting himself on fire and jumping off the Britannia Bridge. The Britannia Bridge is only about 400 yards from Mabel's house, so incredibly close. Police believed this could have stemmed from a guilty conscience, so he became their first person of interest, really, and they went and done a search on this man's house. While doing their routine search, they uncovered obviously the man's suicide notes that he had left for his family, and they even found passages of the Bible that had been translated into Welsh, and these passages of the Bible spoke about the heart, and I believe obviously alluded to sacrifice, because obviously back in those types of days the human heart was taken out as a sacrifice to the gods. So the next thing the police had to do was to identify the shoe print. So obviously, upon their investigation of this man's house, they never found a match for any of his shoes to be one of that print. So they went about to obviously identify this shoe, and they found it to belong to a style of trainer from the brand Levi. And this particular style that had not long come out, it wasn't actually a particularly massive seller for Levi. I don't think the style really was on the shelves for that long, to be honest. the only shop that was nearby that sold this particular style of shoe, they were in Bangor, which is probably about a 25-30 minute drive from Mabel's house. So the particular this particular style of shoe, this particular style of shoe, it only sold about 53 pairs from this shop. 48 of those, they were paid by credit card. So incredibly easy for the police to track down the owners of these. 5 of those obviously paid by cash. Cash transactions are a lot more difficult to track down because there is no blueprint for anyone to go on, because obviously debit cards and credit cards, we all know that those are linked to our address. So obviously the police at this point, they were still on the search for the fingerprint match, but obviously at this point it was bringing in no new leads. The media, they were prevented from disclosing any details about Mabel's murder. I actually, on a side note, I actually do remember this being the case. I mean, I was 9 years old at the time of this murder, but I do remember following it because I was kind of interested. This is the first time I've really heard anything so serious, and it kind of caught my attention at that young of an age. And I really remember it really not getting the recognition it deserved even back then. So about a month after the murder, Mabel's story, it was finally, full details were actually disclosed on the December 20th edition of Crime Watch UK, which that particular episode is actually on YouTube. So if you look up 20th of December 2001, Crime Watch UK, it is actually the first article that they start talking about. So it came out that they were actually already searching for these 2 men who were seen outside Mabel's house in a blue van. One of them was described as fairly tall, and he had a sweeping sort of style hair with a fringe, and the other one was slightly shorter with a crew cut. But obviously I believe that these guys were quickly eliminated from the investigation. So the Crime Watch UK episode, it actually drew a lot of interest, and a lot of people were coming forward with new leads. And one particular lead was from a 17-year-old German exchange student. So she claimed that she was at a party in September 2001, and a 17-year-old boy had come to her, and he apparently was asking her to either she buy his neck or if he could buy her neck. And he was going on about vampires. At first, obviously, she probably thought he was joking, but it's believed that he become quite persistent with this, and he actually got to the point that he was asked to leave the party. At this point, he refused, and the police were called, and he actually asked the arresting officer or the investigating officer if they would buy his neck, and he was swiftly obviously escorted from the property, but no charges were actually brought forward at this particular point. So this girl's lead, it led them to Matthew Hardman. Obviously, as I said, he was 17 years old at this point. So he hadn't come forward for the fingerprint search because obviously the age range they were looking at was not his. So he hadn't come forward to get himself out of that line of inquiry. So on January the 25th, 2002, the police went to Matthew's house. They just obviously wanted to ask him a few questions about the night in particular, so the 24th of November. At this house, so Matthew lived with his mother Julie and her partner. And his house was actually only about 200 metres away from Mabel's house, so obviously incredibly close. So they asked whether Matthew knew Mabel, and if he had been to her house, and he actually answered no to these questions. And his mum sort of interjected at this point, and she basically said, well, no, but that's not true, because you were the paper boy, the local paper boy. He had actually been the paper boy since 1996. And they then asked why he had lied, and Matthew said that it doesn't seem that important at that particular time. I'm just going to point out, obviously, we all know that any small, minute detail, even if it seems useless, just give the police that. If you don't have anything to hide, then you're just going to give out any particular detail to try and get yourself out of that line of inquiry. They then asked if he remembered when he last saw Mabel, or when he had last been at Mabel's house. And he again lied, stating that it had been at least a few years since he had been at the property. And Julie interjected again. She said, well, no, you went there around a couple of months ago on your round. So the police, obviously, they at this point, they had Pete dressed. And they then asked Matthew if they could see his shoe collection. So Matthew then took him up to his bedroom, and in his wardrobe were the particular style of Levi's that they were looking for, these trainers that they were looking for. But obviously they didn't want to pump gas up Matthew's arse. So they just said, oh, we need to take him away, have him tested. This way we can just obviously rule you out as a suspect. So obviously the shoes were bagged up, taken away. At this particular point, they also did take a sample of Matthew's DNA, so they probably took a fingerprint, maybe a swab out of his mouth. I'm not really too sure how they really did it back in those days. So while awaiting the results, Matthew, he was placed under police surveillance, and it was reported that he was the only person in Anglesey at that time who was still actually walking the streets at night. A lot of people were too scared at this point to actually venture out of their house, because obviously the full details of Mabel's death had been made public. People were obviously shit scared, and for all they knew, they could probably have a potential serial killer on their hands. So 2 days later, the results come back as a positive result. So obviously the fingerprint match and possibly the match of the trainer prints. And Matthew, he was arrested on the 18th of January 2002. So while he was being questioned, another search was placed on the home, and this is where they found a jacket in Matthew's bedroom. Inside this jacket was a knife, and this knife, particularly the blade detail, this matched what they believed would have been the weapon. So again, 6-inch blade with a single cutting edge. So obviously this was bagged up as evidence, and they also took Matthew's laptop at this particular time. They also found a meat cleaver in another part of the room and blue latex gloves. So after this, Matthew was questioned for 2 days and he remained calm the whole entire time, didn't show any emotion, and he denied any involvement in the death of Mabel. The only time that he actually did show any sort of emotion, the only time that his demeanour completely changed, when he was told that there was a positive DNA match. Matthew, he was then finally charged with the murder of Mabel Lechon. And once police got the results back, which was a positive match, Matthew was sent to trial. Obviously, he was put on remand, and he was sent to trial at Mould Crown Court. Obviously, Crown Court, that would be in Northwest Wales, and he pled not guilty. So still completely going by the not guilty route, the innocent route. So Matthew's trial, it began in July 2002 and it lasted about 3 weeks. Again, I remember briefly following, like reading this and, you know, sort of piquing my interest. But I believe at the time it wasn't really reported that much, because I believe at this particular time as well was when we had the story of the two 10-year-old girls that had gone missing at that point, so Holly Wells and Jessica Chapman. Obviously, we're all very, very familiar with the Sower murders. So this was actually happening at the same time as Matthew's trial. So Matthew's trial was only getting a very small amount of news coverage at this particular time, whereas obviously everyone was out searching for or praying and following the story of Holly and Jessica. And obviously I'm not saying that obviously one story is more important than the other, but it's just my personal belief that Mabel didn't get the recognition that she deserved, because we are talking about two very, very vulnerable groups in our society. So children obviously being the sole murders, or in the case of Mabel, a very, very elderly woman who wouldn't have been able to put up any sort of resistance, any sort of fight. So the prosecution, they had to piece together their version of events. Obviously, this was due to Matthew's denial, as I stated at the beginning of this video. So it was discussed about Matthew's vampire obsession and that Matthew knew that Mabel lived alone. So obviously, if you do watch any other crime channels on here, they always discuss about the fact that a murderer or an abuser, they look for a few things, and their number ones are desirability and vulnerability. So they then looked into Matthew's laptop and it was discovered that he had been searching and he had bookmarked quite a lot of vampire websites. Also found on his property were a lot of books and magazines about vampires and the occult. And obviously they attributed this to the crime scenes. Obviously, as we discussed, it was the fact of obviously the heart in the milk pan or saucepan. There was obviously the shrine that he had put up with the candlesticks and then the poker sticks that are placed in the shape of a crucifix. He had also started making searches about DNA and forensics at this point as well, and they weren't able to prove whether he had already been searching this or if he had done this after the murder. But again, very, very much a red flag, a huge red flag. You know, why would you need to be searching up DNA and forensics unless you're actually studying for that case, is studying for that sort of thing, which one could argue he was, but not in the way that we would want him to be studying forensics and DNA. So after obviously the prosecution, they put their version of events forward. It was then time for the defence to come forward. And they claimed that Matthew, he wasn't actually obsessed with vampires. It's just his way of showing a keen interest in that particular subject. There is a fine, very, very fine line, a huge fine line between a keen interest and what we would call an obsession, and the fact that you're bookmarking pages on websites dealing with that subject. You've got manuals and books and magazines about that particular subject. That doesn't say a keen interest. You know, if you had a keen interest, you might have one or two books, but not as many as they found. So the defence, they also claimed that the DNA print on Mabel's windowsill, this was left when Matthew had last been to her house to make a delivery. And I don't know. I mean, obviously, I know I'm not an expert in DNA, but that doesn't really make any sense to me because he's claiming that he had been there for a few months. Obviously, with the elements, the way they are in England, especially in Wales, you know, you're living right by the sea. You've got a lot of elements coming up. You've got the sea wind, you've got a lot of rain, particularly at that time of year. You know, if he's talking about not being there since September, that's when it starts being really rainy. So there's a potential that obviously at that point any DNA would have obviously washed away, and it doesn't actually explain as to why his particular DNA was found also contaminated with Mabel's DNA. So obviously his DNA being found in a blood patch and the blood belonging to Mabel. So it then came down to the evidence of the knife that was found in Matthew's possession. Matthew actually admitted that it was his knife, but that he only started carrying this knife around at night as a way of self-defense because he was worried about this killer coming after him, but he still wanted to be able to walk about at night. So this knife had actually been taken off for testing. It was then put forward for the case that 2 samples had actually come off this knife. So Matthew had actually made an attempt to clean the blade. What he didn't realise, or he probably did realise it, but wasn't intelligent enough to notice, but there was actually a split in the handle of the knife, and inside this handle were 2 samples of DNA. One of those samples was obviously from Mabel's blood cells, so from the blood splatter. The other was Matthew's. The defence, they went about trying to argue the possibility of cross-contamination. So they were saying that when the police took this knife from Matthew's property, they had actually placed it in close proximity of items that had been taken from Mabel's house. And at this point, they argued that there was a strong possibility of cross-contamination. The police and the prosecutor, they were able to argue that this was absolute bubbles. They were able to actually prove this wasn't the case at all. The knife had been kept in a complete different area from the items retrieved from Mabel's house. So, on the last day, so it only took the jury about 4 hours to actually find Matthew guilty. And on the 2nd of August, Matthew, like I said, he was found guilty and he was actually handed a life sentence with served a minimum of 12 years. So obviously it's believed that the reason he got such a low sentence was because of his age at the time of the murder. So it's believed that the brain doesn't stop growing until you're 25, and Matthew was only 17 at the time. So they believe that there's still a chance of retribution. There's a chance of actually getting him into therapy and getting him the help that he so desperately needed, and that this would act as a sort of deterrent from him actually committing anything similar in the future. Obviously with a life sentence, so he would have ended up serving obviously the 12 years, but he would then obviously have to report to probation. He will be on a license for the rest of his life. And obviously these licenses come with a very, very hefty set of rules you have to abide to not be recalled back to prison. So it can literally be something petty as maybe stealing a chocolate bar, and he could be recalled back to prison. Or if you ended up obviously having a life sentence, or if you got a life sentence, you'll know what I mean. Like, it would just be the smallest minute thing that could end up causing you to be recalled. So, on the handing down of this sentence, Justice Richards, he went on to say the horrific nature of this murder is plain to all. Why you acted this way is difficult to comprehend, but I am drawn to the conclusion that vampirism has indeed become an obsession. You believed the myth to be true, and that you would be immortal by drinking blood. You found this way too irresistible, and you wanted immortality, but all you have achieved is the brutal ending of someone's life, and then bringing yourself a life sentence. It was said at this point that Julie, she went on to attend each day of the court, and she would actually wave to Matthew from the docks. And on the day of him being sent down, she was seen mouthing the words, "I love you, son." Sometime after, obviously, the court case, Julie, she spoke out, still in defence of her son, still believing that he was innocent. She stated that she was a mental health nurse, or psychiatric nurse, and she tried to say that obviously with that level of training, she would have been able to recognise if there was something in her son that was seen as a trigger warning. She went on to say that Matthew was completely innocent, that he was way too caring. He would actually go around and care for his own elderly grandparents. And it's not to say that obviously he didn't, he probably did. doesn't necessarily mean that he's going to murder his own grandparents, but what's to stop him from committing this atrocious act to another human being, like who's not related to him? Because obviously, as I've already stated, Mabel to him, she was desirable and she was vulnerable. She then went on to read extracts of some letters that Matthew had been sending her. He stated in some letters that he was hoping that she was coping really well with everything that was going on, asking if she was coming to visit him on his upcoming birthday. So obviously his upcoming 18th or 19th birthday at this point. 2003, so Matthew would have been about 19 at this point, maybe coming on close to his 20th birthday, maybe. An article was released and it stated that Matthew was trying to appeal his sentence. But this was quickly obviously quashed. They looked at this and they could see that obviously he has shown no remorse, no guilt. He hadn't accepted the fact that he was guilty. He was obviously trying to get this appeal based on wrongful imprisonment, unlawful imprisonment. So obviously this was quickly quashed. And sometime after, obviously there was a massive gap between this, between his appeal and any other mention of Matthew in the media. In 2017, Chris Canary, so he had actually worked as a nurse in a mental health nurse in UK prisons. He wrote an article about his 12-year career. He also appeared on a program called Murder by the Seaside, and this particular program did a small feature about Matthew. Again, I'm just going to point out that obviously, even though these programs are out there to give you some sort of knowledge about these cases or bring them back to the forefront of your mind, they're not always that factual, and they only really still only talk about a small percentage of the actual case. So if you are interested in these sort of cases, then you are better off just doing your own sort of general research. Don't always rely on these documentaries. These documentaries are only really great to give you a general idea of these cases. So Chris, he went on to detail about Matthew, and he claimed that Matthew was probably one of the most unsettling prisoners that he had actually ever met. He recalled the day that Matthew first come to the prison, and he claimed that Matthew just walked into his office, asked if he was the doctor. Chris said, "No, I'm just a mental health nurse." He then went on to ask Matthew how he was and everything, and Matthew just went on to reply that this was the most exciting thing that's ever happened to him, which already shows you a real juxtaposition of his mind at that point. Chris went on to say that the only time that Matthew actually went on to show any sort of emotion was after he had been found guilty. Chris actually said, believe it or not, that he actually felt really sorry for Matthew. He then went to Matthew's cell to see how he was coping, and Matthew, all he could reply was, "Do you think I'm guilty?" And Chris just looked at him and said, I know you're guilty, you know you're guilty, and left it at that. So another article in 2017, it claimed that 3 North Wales prisoners, Peter Moore, he was sorry, he was sent to prison in the 90s, so in a 4-month period in 1995, he had killed 4 men, and he claimed mental health insanity. He said that he was calling himself, or calling a certain character that had committed the murders, Jason. And claimed that obviously he was Jason from the Friday the 13th films. I don't know how we come across that sort of information, or put out that kind of information, but hey ho. The other case was that of Mark Bridger. So obviously I mentioned that one a little bit on my previous video from last week. Mark was responsible for the death of 5-year-old April Jones. I actually did get my years wrong, so I was in my head last week I was thinking 2015, but it wasn't. It was 3 years earlier. It actually happened in 2012. And then obviously Matthew himself, he was the third. So the guys, their cases, they went to the human rights courts, I'm sorry, and they were trying to argue that a whole life sentence for these guys, the whole life sentence, it was listed as inhumane and degrading. This is one of the biggest reasons I cannot stand human rights protesters. You tell me, what is humane about the crimes that these men committed against innocent, vulnerable people? Why should they not face the punishment for these crimes? Why is it inhumane for them to rot behind bars where they actually belong? They do not belong on our streets, and this is the biggest bugbear of human rights any protesters really. But human rights protesters, they want to argue the rights of rapists, murderers, paedophiles, and it just really, really boils my piss. It really freaking irritates me. Sorry, guys, I'm just going to jump off my soapbox there a little bit. So, Matthew, he has been held at the Alt Course prison, as this is a Category B prison in Liverpool. In 2014, he actually completed his 12-year minimum sentence, but the parole board actually denied any freedom to Matthew because of his inability to accept the fact that he is guilty. So obviously, even to this day, Matthew is still protesting that he's not guilty of the murder. The parole board have obviously looked at this. They see that there's obviously no retribution whatsoever, so they've decided to keep him in. But now, obviously, with this court case that happened in 2017, he actually has to spend the rest of his life behind bars. So that is the end of this story. I would love to know your thoughts and opinions on this. Do you think Matthew should be given a fair chance? I mean, he would now be in his 40s, I believe. Maybe 39 at push. Do you think that Matthew should be given a fair chance? Or do you, like myself and the parole board, do you think that this man will never change? He will never accept his guilt, he's never going to come forward and actually say what he did in 2001. And by doing this and not accepting his guilt, he has actually ruined the rest of his life. So as always, yeah, I would love to know your thoughts and feelings. It's actually turned into a lot longer than what I thought it was going to turn into, but hey, that is the price I pay. The amount of research I've done on this case. So please like, share and subscribe. If you hit that little notification bell, it will alert you to when I'm next posting the video, because I'm not always free on set days. So I don't have a set day that I do filming. I don't have a set day that I've released something. The past few weeks, obviously I've been releasing the videos on a Thursday, filming them on the Wednesday night, and then obviously editing them. But it may not always be like that, so if you just press your notification bell, then obviously it will notify you when I'm next releasing. So again, big massive thank you to all those guys that have subscribed. I'm really hoping to see this great channel grow, and I will see you guys next week for the next case.